Hi everybody. Today we are going to talk about drawing and painting and how these can be incorporated successfully into your books. So before we get started, I just wanted to show you this cover. So this is a cover to a Japanese stab bound journal. So it is blank inside with different colored pages. But the main thing I wanted to show you was the use of kind of this fading technique, which is something that you can do in watercolor. So just think about if you want your paint to be really solid, if you want it to be layered. Here's a great example of lots of layering of paints. There's this background kind of light wash, and then there's a lot of deeper, bold creation with drawing materials, some crayons, Sharpie, and also with more bold paint over the top. Here we have some sponging. So just think about, you can be very creative with the way that you incorporate paint in what you're doing. Here's an example of kind of dry brushing over this sky motif. Same thing with the water element, has some of that dry brushing. All right, so we're gonna start talking about drawing, and we're gonna go super quick because I think drawing is something that you all have a basic understanding of. My tips for you are to use references if you need. So if you know you wanna draw something in this book, let's say it's a portrait, use a reference. Don't expect that you're gonna be exceptional at drawing something if you've never done it before and you haven't practiced, or you haven't looked at the thing very closely. You can either send those to me and I'll print them out. You can look at them on your phone. You can look at them on your device, whatever. Number 2, perfection is overrated. Sometimes it's even better to just create a drawing of a person that is a little more silly, depending on what you are doing, right? Like in this case, I've got a big tongue here hanging out. Maybe this makes the most sense for what my story is, what I'm creating. So don't feel limited by the fact that maybe you are not perfect at drawing. Sometimes it's way more interesting when you do something that is more playful and abstract. Okay, so that's some basics with drawing. The last thing I'll say about it is you can draw over top of things that you've painted. It's a really nice way to work. There's a ton of drawing materials. I'm just showing you pencil, but I have colored pencils, crayons. All of those are excellent for books, so just ask if you'd like to utilize those. Sharpies too. Here, I've got some watercolor painting that is dry now, so it's a really nice place that I could go back over top of what I have with the color, and I could be very playful with what I want to do on top of it. And all of a sudden, it makes it just a little more interesting because I have that color behind it. So don't be afraid to do some painting knowing that you can go on top of it with more bold, specific materials. All right, some basics of painting. We're going to talk about the difference between watercolor and acrylic. So watercolor often comes in these palettes, if you've ever seen those before. So we're going to utilize right from there. I have a bowl of water right next to me, and I have a paintbrush. Bigger paintbrushes are good for bigger spaces. Smaller paintbrushes, smaller detail, but just because this is small, I'm going to use this smaller round brush. Okay, so watercolor is really good for washes. So there's 2 types. You can do water down on your paper first, and then you can go back and you can add more pigment to it. And what happens with that is that it kind of fades out into the paper because you've got that extra water. You can also do wet on dry. So in this case, I'm not adding any pre-water to it, and you can see I can get a much more specific shape with it. Okay, watercolor is great for backgrounds. The more water you add to your color, the more faded it is, and then you can go over it a lot easier like I showed you here. Now, with watercolor, you really want to think of paper. I'm just doing this on drawing paper, but really if you want to do a lot with the material, you probably want to use watercolor paper, so just ask. Last thing with watercolors, the beauty of it is that you can mix like right in front of you. So if I want to get something that's kind of between a red and an orange, I can do that. Let's say I want it to be a little muddier. I want to add some brown to it. So don't be afraid to just mix as you go to create your own colors. Sometimes this can be really cool incorporated with some of the other things that you do. Okay, so watercolor is more washed out. If I want any lines that are more bold, I just want less water, and then I can go in and get that more specific look. She's beautiful. Okay, so watercolor, done. Acrylic paint, so it comes in all of the tubes. This is better for thicker, solid layers. Still, if you're doing a lot of painting, you probably want to use watercolor paper. A lot of people will say, I want to do a landscape. I want grass. So they go and they grab the green from the bottle. I challenge you to find grass that is this exact green, okay? Especially if you're doing a whole field of it. It just doesn't happen. So my main tip for you here is to mix or layer your colors. Sometimes picking another color that's similar on the color wheel, in this case I picked kind of like a yellow gold, you can go and add a lot more interest to the color. You can also play around with what happens when you create texture, right? So all of a sudden here, I'm creating a texture that kind of resembles grass, even though it's not a solid layer, okay? If I took some of that green and I layered some blue into it, it changes the feeling as well. Sometimes layering multiple colors just gives you much more depth, much more interest in what you're creating. So feel free to play around with painting. Acrylic, if you want a really solid layer, you can do that. Just takes a lot of a coat, but you could also do this with collaging paper. So just think about why you're doing it, what your edges look like. Adding a lot of paint can sometimes be problematic to your picture because it can warp the paper. If I apply other paint while it's wet, it kind of blends in a little bit. If I wait until it's dry, then it stays more solid. So watercolor is good for washes. Acrylic you typically use for more bold, solid layers. So my tips for those, mixing and layering for best results. Think about the paper you choose for your piece and just limit water. You don't want it to all be warped.